The People's Picnic. Oh, hi there. I was just reading about critical race theory because I thought it was just an extension of the civil rights movement. But according to Critical Race Theory, an Introduction by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanik, they said something very interesting. Okay. The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourse takes up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, setting, group, and self-interest and emotions, and the unconscious. Here we go. Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. Say, what? Okay, if critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, then what is their founding? What are they based on? Let's see. As the reader will see, critical race theory builds on the insights of two previous movements, critical legal studies and radical feminism, to both of which it owes a large debt. It also draws on certain European philosophers and theorists such as Antonio Gramsci, Marxist, Michel Foucault, as well as from the American radical tradition exemplified by such figures as Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, I doubt it, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Black Power and Chicano movements of the 60s and early 70s. From critical legal studies, the group borrowed the idea of legal indeterminacy, the idea that not every legal case has one correct outcome. Okay. Interesting. All right, spin-off movements. Although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many scholars in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use CRT's ideas to understand issues of school discipline and hierarchy, tracking, affirmative action, high-stakes testing, controversies over curriculum and history, bilingual and multicultural education, and alternative and charter schools. Thought it had nothing to do with education except for legal education. I guess that was misinformation as well. Okay, basic tenets of critical race theory. What do critical race theorists believe? Probably not every writer would subscribe to every tenet set out in this book, but many would agree on the following positions. First, racism is ordinary, not aberrational. Normal science. The usual way society does business, the common, everyday experience of most people of color in this country, assume they're writing from the United States. Second, most would agree that our system of white over color, that's an assumption that I don't think most people in our society believe in, but maybe the critical race theorists do, we'll see. So most would agree that our system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material, for the dominant group. Okay. The first lecture Dominant group. Let's see, are we talking about the financial hegemony, the medical hegemony, the leftist domination of mainstream media and fact checkers and every highway of communication that public discourse takes place in? Okay. Colorblind or formal conceptions of equality expressed in rules that insist only on treatment that is the same across the board can thus remedy only the most blatant forms of discrimination, such as mortgage redlining or an immigration dragnet in a food processing plant that targets Latino workers, or the refusal to hire a black PhD rather than a white college dropout, which stand out and attract our attention. Okay. The second feature, sometimes called interest convergence. All right. Derek Bell. We've heard about that. Very interesting.
And I remember that the black law students had organized an orientation for the first-year students. And one of the persons who spoke at that orientation was Professor Bell. And I remember him sauntering up to the front and not giving us a lecture, but engaging us in a conversation. Open up your hearts and your minds to the words of Professor Derek Bell.
Now, after he said, open up your hearts and minds to the words of Derek Bell, let's do as we were told and open our hearts and minds to the words of this controversial figure. Now, here he is talking about what it was that kept an old friend of his motivated during a time when racial tension was running high in the 1960s.
Why do you do it? And she said, Derek, I'm an old lady. I live to harass white folks. And the marvelous thing about her, the way those neighborhoods, she lived near whites who were supportive of her. So she wasn't talking, it wasn't a racial thing, but she knew that those people who were oppressing her were white. She knew that she didn't have their power, she didn't have their money, she certainly didn't have their guns. But she saw her life as given in trouble, being on the case all the time. And I've accepted that as my motto. I live to harass white folks. So those at Harvard and some of the other places need to be on guard.
Now, concern about Bell's radicalism was raised back in 1990 by our next guest, renowned economist and author Thomas Sowell. Now, here's what he had to say about Professor Bell.
Derek Bell.
Yes.
Harvard Law School, black man.
Yes.
Threatened the law school if they didn't hire a black woman.
Yes.
He's leaving.
Well, no. Well, he's taking. If I understand it correctly, he's taking unpaid leave until such time as they hire a woman of color, as he says. But he's also said that by black he does not mean skin color. He means those who are really black, not those who think white and look black. And so what he's really saying is he wants ideological conformity in the people that are hired to fill this position.
I mean, is he a hero?
To me?
No, basically, I mean, from the press coverage you've seen, is he a hero to the...
Well, he's looked at as an idealist who is self-sacrificing and so on. I suppose one could have, if one wanted to look at it that way, seen Hitler that way in his early days. It's just a question of where that kind of idealism leads. He has launched a despicable attack on a young black professor at the law school who doesn't go along with this.
Okay. Let's see, what else do they say about civil rights? They say also see liberalism. Okay. Liberalism, generally a good thing, I would say. Critique of liberalism, critique of. Okay. Well, let us see. Are the liberals listening? We're going to critique you. Okay, just skipping down to their conclusion here. Civil rights gains for communities of color coincide with the dictates of white self-interest. Little happens out of altruism alone. Interesting, okay. So distrust of liberalism is the critique of critical race theorists. Let's see. Scholars question whether the much vaunted system of civil rights remedies ended up doing people of color much good. In a classical article in the Harvard Law Review, Derek Bell argues that civil rights advances for blacks always seem to coincide with changing economic conditions and the self-interest of elite whites. Sympathy, mercy, and evolving standards of social decency and conscience amounted to little, if anything. Audaciously, Bell selected Brown versus Board of Education, the crown jewel of U.S. Supreme Court jurisprudence, and invited his readers to ask themselves why the American legal system suddenly in 1954 opened up as it did. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund had been courageously and tenaciously litigating school desegregation cases for years, usually losing or at best winning narrow victories. In 1954, however, the Supreme Court unexpectedly gave them everything they wanted. Why just then? Bell hypothesized that world and domestic considerations, not moral qualms over blacks' plight, precipitated the path-breaking decision. By 1954, the country had ended the Korean War. The Second World War was not long past. In both wars, African American soldiers had performed valiantly in the service of democracy. Many of them returned to the United States, having experienced for the first time in their lives a setting in which cooperation and survival took precedence over racism. They were unlikely to return willingly to regimes of menial labor and social vilification. For the first time in years, the possibility of mass domestic unrest loomed. Okay. Liberalism. Okay, 26 through 31. Critique of liberalism. As mentioned earlier, critical race scholars are discontented with liberalism as a framework for addressing America's racial problems. Maybe they would consider fascism or tyranny. I don't know. If liberalism doesn't work, what does? Many liberals believe in color blindness and neutral principles of constitutional law. Yeah, judge one on their character, not the color of their skin. Sounds about right. They believe in equality, especially equal treatment for all persons, regardless of their different histories or current situations. Yeah. Some even managed to convince themselves that the election of Barack Obama, with the election of Barack Obama, we arrived at a post-racial stage of social development. Well, the white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country. Good to know. I didn't know that. Okay. Today, in 2021. Okay. Colorblindness can be admirable as when a governmental decision maker refuses to give in to local prejudices. But it can be perverse, for example, when it stands in the way of taking account of difference in order to help people in need. Okay, I think people can be in need regardless of the color of their skin, so that was a weird assumption, but an extreme version of color blindness seen in certain Supreme Court opinions today holds that it is wrong for the law to take any note of race, even to remedy a historical wrong. Critical race theorists, or crits, as they are sometimes called, hold that color blindness of the latter form will allow us to redress only extremely egregious racial harms, ones that everyone should notice and condemn. But if racism is embedded in our thought process and social structures, as it is for these guys, as deeply as many crits believe, Then, the ordinary business of society, the routines, practices, and institutions that we rely on to do the world's work, will keep minorities in subordinate positions. Only aggressive, color-conscious efforts to change the way things are will do much to ameliorate misery. As an example of one such strategy, one critical race scholar proposes that society look to the bottom in judging new laws. If they would not relive the distress of the poorest group, or worse, if they compound it, we would reject them. Although colorblindness seems firmly entrenched in the judiciary, a few judges have made exceptions in unusual circumstances. Crits are suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights. Particularly some of the older, more radical CRT scholars with roots in racial realism and an economic view of history believe the moral and legal rights are apt to do the right holder much less good than we'd like to think. Moreover, rights are almost always cut back when they conflict with the interest of the powerful. Reminds me of masking or mandating vaccinations. For example, hate speech, which targets mainly minorities, gays, lesbians, and other outsiders. What about deplorable? Is that maybe not? It's too soon. Okay. Receives legal protection, while speech that offends the interests of empowered groups finds a ready exception in First Amendment law. There's a lot here, just trying to skim to some of these juicier parts. Okay, so lest the reader think that the crits are too hard on well-meaning liberals, bear in mind that in recent years the movement has softened somewhat. When it sprang up in the 1970s, complacent, backsliding liberalism represented the principal impediment to racial progress. Today, that obstacle has been replaced by rampant, in-your-face conservatism that co-opts Martin Luther King Jr.'s language, finds little use for welfare, affirmative action, or other programs vital to the poor and minorities, and wants to militarize the border and make everyone speak English when businesses are crying for workers with foreign language proficiency. Because most critical race theorists believe things are more complicated than that, many of them have stopped focusing on liberalism and its ills and have begun to address the conservative tide. You know, the ones who fought and gave their lives to free the slaves 150 years ago. I'm not sure why they don't criticize the founders of the KKK and those who wrote and enacted Jim Crow laws. Those would be Democrats. I think they need some crits as well. And a determined group maintains that rights are not a snare and a delusion. Rather, they can bring genuine gains, while the struggle to obtain them unifies the group in a sense of common venture. All right, what else do we have about the critique of liberalism? 64 and 65. Hey, turned right to it. It takes a multitude of the oppressed to make their voices heard and felt. But what about the voices that do not fit into one single category of oppression? Will social progress let them slip through the cracks? Well, not if they're routinely censored by partisan entities, but these issues are particularly acute regarding inter- and intra-minority relations and tensions. They also explain some of the crits' impatience with liberalism. The reader will recall that CRT takes liberalism to task for its cautious, incremental quality. They basically criticize them for not being bloody revolutionaries like the full-blown, openly Marxist But anyway, when we are tackling a structure as deeply embedded as race, radical measures are in order. Otherwise, the system merely swallows up the small improvements one has made and everything goes back to the way it was. Ignoring the problem of intersectionality, as liberalism often does, because it's divisive, but anyway, risks doing things by half measures and leaving major sectors of the population dissatisfied. No, only the control freaks. Classical liberalism also has been criticized as overly caught up in the search for universals, such as admission standards for universities and sentencing guidelines that are the same for all. Critics point out that this approach is apt to do injustice to individuals whose experience and situation differ from the norm. And I would argue that many situations differ from the norm regardless of race, but we continue. They are race theorists, so let's stay on point here. They call for individualized treatment, context that pays attention to minorities' lives. This deficiency is apt to be particularly glaring in the case of double minorities such as Black women, gay Latinos, or Muslim women wearing headscarves, whose lives are twice removed from the experience of mainstream Americans. Some observers hold that all minority races should comprise their differences and form a united front against racism in general. The danger in this centralized approach is that certain minority groups, socioeconomic classes, and sexual orientations may end up better off and others worse. Recall how shabbily Black women were treated in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, rarely allowed to speak for the group, made to march in the second row, and relegated, with a few exceptions, to support roles. Only lately have Black women and Latinas emerged as powerful voices on the American scene. Now they need to update this. It's Latinx. Get with the times. Perhaps the essentialism, anti-sensationalism debate sets in when mainstream thought is beginning to see the validity in the larger group's complaints, like the automobile with deferred maintenance, smaller subgroups that have Okay. Let's see. Back to liberalism. Definition of 178. So let's see. They're also going to define what they, at least early critical race theorists were hardcore critics of, and some of them still are, but they can't openly say that because they need modern liberals to be their useful idiots here. So let's see here. Liberalism. Political philosophy that holds that the purpose of government is to maximize liberty, sounds good, in civil rights, the view that law should enforce formal equality and treatment of all citizens. Now, why would you be critical of that unless you're a racist? Wait, don't touch that dial. Please subscribe. My channel's new and I need all the help I can get. So give me a thumbs up, a comment, a share, a subscribe, a bell rung. So I was in the social sciences section and I was looking for this book. Then I saw this, which triggers me because I'm white and it reminds me how fragile I am. It reminds me how racist Robin DiAngelo is, but hey, she wrote a book to explain about it. Her own racism. How progressive white people perpetuate racial harm.